Okay, this is a test for Elevate, the end of Unit 1. There's two parts to this test. One part is the text-based discussion that you'll be having with a group, and I'll just come and observe. So you really don't need to know a lot about this part. Just know that you'll be working with your group to go over some of the chapters and some things that you've noticed regarding human rights in the chapters of Esperanza that we've been talking about. And the next section here is the part that I'm going to read to you and that you can follow along and then fill in your information as we go. Feel free to pause at any moment if you are unclear of how to do something, and you can move on from there. So starting, end of Unit 1 assessment, short response, meaning you're going to write a short thing. Questions from Esperanza Rising. Make sure your name is on it as well as your number. So, short response. You'll need to copy a copy of your Esperanza Rising Blue Book to answer these questions. And you're welcome to use your Blue Book and your workbook at any point to answer these questions. So the structure of Esperanza Rising has exposition. Beginning of the story is describing how things are before the action begins. There's the rising action, which is a series of conflicts and crises in the story that build towards the climax. The climax is the actual turning point when something important happens that changes the direction of the story. Then there's the falling action, and that's the action that happens after the climax and starts to guide the story toward the resolution or the ending. So number 1, explain how Chapter 6, Las Cebollas, or onions, fits into the overall structure of Esperanza Rising. Use the information above as a resource to complete the table. And again, you're able to use your Blue Book to decide what part of this structure do you think we're in and why. So Chapter 6, Las Cebollas, on page 100. How does the chapter fit into the overall structure of the story and why? So which one of these do you think it is? And tell me why you think it's in that one. Okay, number 2. Reread pages 110 to 113. How does Isabel respond to having to stay home and not work while everyone else works? Cite specific details from the text that show how Isabel handles the situation. Include at least one quotation from the text to support your thinking. Number 3. During Las Cebollas, Isabel must teach Esperanza many things even though she is younger and has had a less privileged life. How does Isabel react to having to teach Esperanza so many things? Cite specific examples from the text, including one quotation from the text to support your thinking. I'm going to now read to you pages 110 to 113. You may follow along in your book to help you with the answers to number 2. All right, page 110. We're going to start after it passed. After it passed, the sharp smell told her there were onions, the dry outer skins being shredded by the wind. Another truck followed. Again, the smell bit into her senses. It was still early, so the air was cool, but the sun was bright, and she knew it would be hot soon. The hens pecked and poked around the front steps. They must have been happy to be off the train. Esperanza shooed them out of her way as she turned and walked next door. The babies were still in their pajamas. Isabel was struggling to feed Lupe her oatmeal, while Pepe crawled on the floor. Splotches of his cereal still stuck to his cheeks. As soon as he saw Esperanza, he reached up for her. "Let's clean them up," said Isabel, "and then I'll show you the camp." First, Isabel took Esperanza to the platform she was to sweep and showed her where the brooms were stored. Then she walked through the rows of cabins, each with baby on her hip. As they passed open doors, Esperanza could already smell the beans and onions that someone had started simmering for dinner. Women were dragging big metal washtubs beneath the shade trees. A group of young boys kicked a ball up and down the dirt road, stirring up dust. A little girl, wearing a man's undershirt as a dress, ran up to Isabel and took her hand. "This is Sylvia. She's my best friend. Next week we will go to school together." Sylvia switched around and grabbed Esperanza's free hand. Espera looked down at Sylvia's dirty hands. Sylvia grinned up at her, and Esperanza's first thought was to pull her hand away and wash it as soon as possible. Then she remembered Mama's kindness to the peasant girl on the train, and her disappointment in Esperanza. She didn't want Sylvia to start crying if she were to pull away. She looked around at the dusty camp and thought that it must be hard to stay clean in such a place. She squeezed Sylvia's hand and said, "I have a best friend too. Her name is Marisol, and she lives in Aguascalientes." Isabel introduced Esperanza to Irene and Melina, two women who were hanging clothes to dry on a long line stretched between the cabins and a tree. Irene had long gray hair tied in a tail. Melina didn't look much older than Miguel, and she already had a baby of her own. "We heard the story of how you came from Aguascalientes," said Melina. "My husband is from there. He used to work for Señor Rodriguez." Esperanza's face lit up at the news. "He knew my father since he was a boy. Do you think your husband knew Marisol, Señor Rodriguez's daughter?" Melina laughed. No, I'm sure he didn't. He was un campesino, a field servant. He would not know the family." Esperanza felt awkward and didn't mean to make Melina admit that her husband was a servant. But Melina didn't seem bothered and began recalling other farms her husband had worked in Aguascalientes. Isabel pulled on Esperanza's arm. "We need to change the babies." As they walked back to the cabin, she said, "They are mother and daughter. They come over to talk and crochet with my mother all the time. How do you know all about us already?" Isabel raised her hand and made her finger tap up and down on her thumb as if a mouth was talking. "Everyone in camp knows each other's business." If you need to hear this again, go ahead and rewind and play again, and do the best you can to fill out the page.